Today on Lead with Bubba Scott, we're joined by Dr. Kevin Mullaney, a retired Navy captain with 30 years of active military service and a renowned leadership scholar. We'll hear about his experience leading under the sea, the pedagogical approach to leadership development at the Naval Academy and as an executive coach at the Harvard Business School, and his scientific process for measuring leadership growth. Let's get it. Dr. Kevin Mullaney, welcome to Lead with Bubba Scott. It's great to have you on the show.
Absolutely. Really happy to be here.
So I know you grew up as an Army brat, and you ultimately ended up serving in the Navy as a submarine officer, which is about as 180 out with regards to the military. So can you talk about what it was like growing up in an Army family and how that shaped you?
Yeah, interesting. My dad was Army guy. He was logistics. So we were a pretty typical Army family from that era. So I think everybody spent some time in Germany. So we were in Nuremberg for 3 years. My dad was a very disciplined guy. He grew up in a farm in South Dakota where they didn't have any natural irrigation. So they called that a dirt farm. So you're pretty much counting on the rain. So it's not the good real estate
Yeah.
to have as a farmer. So I would say he's a pretty tough guy, not a lot of emotions, pretty straightforward. So I would say my upbringing was well structured. I was the youngest of 4 kids, and I was the troublemaker by a long shot. I didn't have a bad heart. I never believed in rules per se. I always figured that there was a principle that went with the rule, and so I was always trying to get to the principle of things and trying to not follow the rules to the greatest extent possible. But what got me into the Navy is, so I was the third brother to go to Notre Dame on an ROTC scholarship. And so I didn't really ever expect to make a career in the military, but my brothers had paved a nice pathway for me. And so I kind of just skied behind that boat. We all went with whoever gave us the most money. So the Navy gave me the most money, and so acres away, which I have to say did not make my dad sad at all.
Yeah, that's funny. It is awesome the pull that your older brothers can have. I also had two older brothers, both of whom went to the Naval Academy, which is exactly I haven't thought of it that way, but just grabbing onto the rope behind the boat and getting pulled along. So that's really awesome. I'm pretty interested in what you said about you were always interested in the principle behind the rules, because I think that definitely indicates a lot of or makes a lot of sense with what you went on to study academically. So can you go a little bit more into what you meant? Why are you interested more in the principle as opposed to just following the rules?
Well, so academically, I was an engineer that became an English major. Lots of reasons there, and then became an engineer again with the Navy. They turned me into a nuclear engineer, and then I went back while I was teaching at the prep school and got a master's in English. And I had a dream of being an English teacher still. Not good at following life plans, so ended up staying in the Navy. And then I was picked up for the permanent military professor program. I actually was trying to be an English professor, but they didn't have any billets, so I applied to be a philosopher, and the Navy told me I was gonna be a psychologist. So I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, and so the funny thing about that is probably the biggest focus of my intellectual and academic work is personality, and I think there are some deep personality reasons. I think that's one of the differentiators between people is whether you look for structure internally or externally. So if you're playing with Myers-Briggs, then it would be the sensing versus intuiting dimension. If you're working with a Big Five framework, it would be openness. But I think people who are looking for people who are looking for external structure and rules, and that's what makes them comfortable. And people who have essentially an internal moral compass that's more based on principle. It's easier for that compass to get a little off track. But one of the questions I ask in class talking about personality is, do you stop at stop signs? Because I don't. Because the principle of a stop sign is to yield and not to run into things. And
Yeah.
that sounds pretty simple, but I think that there are people who stop at stop signs and think it's the right thing to do is stop at stop signs because if everybody followed the rule, then there wouldn't be any problems. So they're getting that structure in the external world versus people who are perhaps looking at the principle of things and making their determinations on that. That was a pretty lengthy answer to your question, probably more you're looking for.
No, that's great. I think it's again, that's a fascinating concept because I think certainly in the leadership that the leadership education I received in the Marine Corps, we talk a lot about commander's intent
Mhm.
and giving people the why you're doing something. So basically, the idea that, if you want to take a hill or something like that, you tell your subordinates the reasoning behind why you're taking the hill, your intent behind taking the hill. For some reason, they're not able to take the hill, but they're able to achieve your desired end state. They're still able to satisfy the requirements for mission execution. So it's pretty fascinating that you were kind of identifying that was a key point of interest as you were a kid, and certainly influenced some of the things that you went on to study. I know we're definitely going to talk about your work as a permanent military professor, but before we get there, as we mentioned, you worked on nuclear submarines. You're actually the second guest on the show from the nuclear submarine community. Andrea Howard was
Oh,
just
very
on the
nice.
other day. Yeah, and we had some great discussions with her, and she's still en route to potentially taking an exo path. So I'd be very interested in just if you could describe the experience and the differences between being a junior officer, leading on a submarine, and then very fascinating construct within the military, the job of the executive officer,
Mm.
which by the way is like, that's a huge deal to be the XO of a submarine. So I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, what stood out about the submarine force is that we're a small unit and we're very competency based. I would even go so far as to say as a lot of submariners are a little bit strange. But what makes you accepted in our community is your competence, your ability to deliver on the most basic thing. Because we're a small unit, there's nowhere to hide as far as responsibility goes. And I would say that was probably the thing that I didn't know I was getting into with the submarine force, but it turned out to be the best possible thing for me as an individual, as far as leadership context, was just you hear Jocko talk about like the extreme ownership. My version of that, having been a junior officer and then head in an XO, this is my version of it. You show up on a submarine, and I'm going to point to you and say you're the sonar officer. Then an hour later, I'm going to ask you why your sonar is broken, and you'll say I just got here. And I'll say, "I don't care. Do you remember when I pointed at you and told you you were the sonar officer? It's it's your problem. Go figure out what the solution is and come tell me and the captain what the answer is gonna be." That was kind of my experience of it. I don't know if that's generalized, but that's the way I experienced it as a junior officer and the way that I purposely raised my junior officers in that way. Kinda that commander's intent, always making sure they understand what the endpoint is, but, just a absolute expectation that you're gonna deliver that, and you're gonna figure out how to do that. I fell in love with that, to be honest. That's what probably kept me in. I always wanted to go off and be a professor, but I never didn't like being a submariner, and it was exactly that. The other thing with submarines, because they're small, you can kind of occupy as big a territory as you can competently manage. So that was fun as a junior officer because we had the JO Mafia and we kind of took over the ship a little bit. We ran everything because if we could, then no one would stop us from doing that. So we would write all the watch bills and everything like that. Even like the officer rotations, who would have what job. No one asked us to. We just wrote up a document and we submitted it to the department heads who sent it to the captain because we had a good idea of what would be the best rotation for officers. So I don't know if I'm answering your question at all, but
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, and I think that's such a great depiction of a healthy, cadre of junior officers, where my dad would always say "sua sponte," like taking the initiative to knock things out, and I think what's so wonderful about being an O3 or, O1 through O3 in the Navy or Marine Corps is you have a lane that you're in that you can take complete ownership of. And like
right.
you said, you can fill up a larger lane, as the case may be. And that allows you to be so good at at what's in your lane. But what I think is so wonderful about that, which is great from a, junior leading upwards, it's fantastic. But also I think that speaks really highly of the intelligence of the senior officers on your ship, that they knew, okay, we have this motivated group of younger guys. Let's let them
Right.
grab the reins of this, because now they have competent people filling up, growing in responsibility, but now they can be heads out looking at the higher level issues because they know they have a bunch of go-getters leading from the bottom up. It's super cool. And one thing that sticks out too is you mentioned one of your foci is personality, or you've always
Mhm.
interested in studying different personalities. I can only imagine the different personalities that you encountered during your submarine career, whether it's a senior chief or a skipper or, you know, junior sailors doing awesome things. I'd be very interested. I think a lot of people think that when you step into the role of the executive officer, you have to portray a certain personality. And so if you
Mm.
could you explain the role of an XO on a submarine? And then eventually I'd love to hear your perspective on, do you have to change your personality
Mm.
to fit certain jobs?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the role of the XO on a submarine is just to make everything happen. There's very few things that the XO actually has to do. There's lots of things the XO has to review and to sign and to direct, but honestly, if you're really doing a good job as an XO, you're almost like the conductor of an orchestra, and you're making sure that each piece is firing on time and is well coordinated with everything else. So what you're hinting at a little bit is that you also become in some ways the accountability officer. And so every piece that isn't firing on command, you're the one who's breathing down their neck or holding them accountable in whatever way that you do that. And I will say it's an interesting job as well because as you're part of a command triad, so it's the commanding officer, the executive officer, and the chief of the boat, who's the senior enlisted on board. And so the way that a healthy command relationship works, and I had this conversation with my chief, but this is the way it was with the captain and myself, is that it was no holds barred in the captain's stateroom. You know, I would tell him that I thought his ideas were terrible and that they wouldn't work. But, and I would try to exercise influence and change directions if I thought that that was the best thing. But as soon as you walk out of the doorway, there should be no one can tell the difference between you and the commanding officer. So oftentimes you're making ideas work that you don't think are good ideas sometimes. And I don't think I'm not this no comment on my commanding officer when I was XO or anything else. I think when you have 2 humans, you're gonna come up with different ways of doing things. And part of the beauty of a command structure is that the one person deciding this is how that we're gonna do it gives us a unity of focus and action. So, that unity and focus is often of more value than a better idea and the effort that it takes to get to the best idea sometimes. So that's an interesting kind of place to be where you're making someone else's vision a reality to the best of your ability. So 2 things on that. Personality-wise, it is interesting. I am not a high conscientious person, and my job was to be the conscience of a ship. So there's a role demand there that I had to step into and fill, which was not my most natural thing and was not not my happiest spot, but there was enough autonomy, there was enough creative problem solving, there was enough motivation and relationship to make that all work. I mean, I think that I held good accountability on my ship, but I did try to do so very much through relationships. So two experiences that go along with that. I had great department heads, and I had a look on my face, and I'm not even sure exactly what that look looked like. But when I would walk into the room with that look on the face, they'd say, "All right, XO, just tell us what the problem is, and we'll go fix it." But they were wonderful, talented human beings. So they would often unload me of those things. So the accountability piece with them especially was not difficult. The other thing is that, talking about the commanding officer, and I had better relationships probably with some of the officers that we worked with, and so those officers would assume that anything they didn't like came from the captain, anything they did like came from me, and they were only about 50% correct on that. When I was checking off the ship, they were like, "Oh, we know this," and I'm like, "Actually, that one was mine."
Yeah.
So I had to come clean on some of those things, but, I worked hard, I worked hard. I would say I didn't work hard to do relationships. Relationships were the natural kind of vector for me. So those I found that you could maintain accountability with a clear vision of what excellence was, such that you could have conversations about things that weren't excellent, and a real commitment to the people that you're working with.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's so interesting because I completely agree that one of the key roles of the XO is accountability
Mhm.
and just holding the standard, making sure the expectation is occurring and the standard is being upheld. But I think it's really nice how you point out that what that looks like could be different for any leader. right? The desired end state that we keep talking about is accountability, that people are upholding the standard, that the direction given by people in leadership positions is being followed, and that's your role as the XO to ensure that that's happening. But I think a lot of people conflate holding people accountable
Mhm.
with being abrasive or
Right,
being
right.
a hard ass, for lack of a better word. And I think by wielding influence through relationship building, you're able to achieve that same end state in a different way. For some people, it might mean ratcheting up the intensity, and sometimes that does work. But I completely agree that if you have strong relationships, if you've developed trust and people want to uphold their end of the bargain, that's the same outcome as someone who, is more strictly directing adherence to the standards. So I think that's a really interesting way to look at that. And one other thing that really sticks out about what you said is just the idea of giving feedback to a commander or giving feedback to your leaders. I think that in so many instances, people are loath to actually
Mhm.
push back on guidance from leadership, and I think they're afraid of repercussions by their leaders. I think, obviously it's incumbent on leaders to create a culture of psychological safety where people can raise their hand when they see an issue, but at the same time, it is absolutely your duty to communicate, and you're failing your leader as a subordinate if you're not articulating the issues with that you see. And of course, there's nuance to that when you do that, but you talked about in those private conversations. And then once he's heard you out or she's heard you out, you're able to go execute the plan. But I think it's when people are afraid to speak up or afraid to speak their mind, I don't see it as much as failing yourself as much as I do you're failing the person who's appointed over you who relies on honest feedback from you and can't, a ship can't function with a bunch of sycophantic,
Right,
O fours.
right.
So, uh,
One of my best assets throughout my entire career is that in my mind, was getting out of the Navy at every juncture.
yeah.
And so it gave me almost the absolute freedom to not give any thought to my fitness reports or my rankings or anything else like that, and just take the job that was in front of me and own it. I had a good experience with it was a bad experience, but I had an XO who failed and then was fired from the ship. And he was constantly trying to guess what the captain wanted and
Yeah.
do it, as opposed to inhabit the role. And watching him fail was instructive to me and taught me that I might ultimately fail. But if I'm going to go down, I'm going to go down playing the game the way I think the game ought to be played, doing the things that I think are important, and not trying to guess what other people think is important. And
Absolutely.
that was really, really empowering for me. I mean, ironically, the way it works out is that if you stop thinking about the ancillary stuff and just focus on having the best department or division or ship, then the promotions will take care of themselves for the most part.
Absolutely, and how many times have you had a leader appointed over you who is saying something that it does not sound like that's actually what the commander or the person at the top was saying at all, and it
Right.
just you can't imagine that person saying that, and ultimately what it comes down to is that middle level leader not actually asking the question, not doing their duty to give feedback to the
Right.
CO, to
Right.
that senior person, so that's it's a really important insight, and yeah, I've absolutely seen that with some folks who were appointed over me, who they were afraid of bringing up a concept with the boss, or they didn't wanna have those uncomfortable conversations, so they would try to predict what that person wants, and then, there were a couple instances where that would have potentially led to an unsafe situation, so
Right.
in the different roles I had where you did have direct access to the CO, go and ask them the question like, "Hey, is this what you're saying?" And they're like, "No, what?" Yes.
Why would I
So
say
it's
that? It's terrible.
exactly, that's a crazy idea. Like, why would I ever say that? You're like, "Well, okay." Um, but yeah, that's definitely fascinating, and it cuts to, I think one of my core leadership beliefs is, you learn perhaps more from bad leaders than you do from good ones. It's incredible all the things that you were able to face, and again, leading a nuclear submarine, as the executive officer, there are so many high stress situations I'm sure you had. What is interesting, as we talked about at the beginning, is as you were able to step away from the fleet and get these academic opportunities. So you taught English at the Naval Academy Prep School.
That's correct.
And during that period of time, that's when you got your master's. And then ultimately you went and pursued the permanent military professor program, which is super cool and allowed you to study psychology. And then that led to uh, the work that you're currently doing now. So, can you talk about just can we walk through a little bit what your career was like once you stepped into the permanent military professor role and then some of the major things that you've worked on?
Yeah, certainly. The little advertisement for the permanent military professor, the best deal in the Navy. Uh, as far as I'm concerned, for almost anything you do in the Navy, if they send you to get education, then there's got to be a payback. And so, with the permanent military professor, they send you for 4 years to get a PhD, and the payback is that you have to stay at the Naval Academy until your statutory retirement. So for me, that was 4 years at the University of Illinois, and then the payback was 11 years of teaching at the Naval Academy.
Wow.
Which is all I ever wanted to do really anyway is,
Yeah.
teach, and what a great place to teach. So once I got to the Naval Academy, we have 4 core leadership courses, a freshman leadership course, a sophomore ethics course, ethics for the junior officer, a, junior leadership course, and then a senior law course. So I started off in the course that I taught you in was, the junior leadership course. I think that was my first semester teaching here at the Naval Academy. The biggest lesson I'd been teaching at NAPS as a lieutenant, and I came in as a commander, and, by nature, I'm kind of a smartass, so I like to tease my students, and I had to learn to ratchet it back a little bit 'cause, they weren't as ready to take it from a commander as they were a lieutenant. But, so I spent a couple years with the, junior level leadership course, which is really about organizational behavior. It's about, our model is that you have a leader, a follower, and a situation, and there's these interactions and ways of being and managing those interactions. After a couple years, though, I shifted to the plebe leadership course, the freshman leadership course, and that kind of became my baby. There was a fair amount of open chalkboard to write on with that one. So there was a lot of opportunity to bring a lot of things that I thought were important into that course. I would my version of that course is I think your quality as a leader depends a lot on your quality as a person, and I think there aren't a lot of bad people in the world, but I think there are a lot of people who are bad at being people. And so in a lot of ways, the course is about how to be good at being a person in the first place.
Mm.
Understanding where your thoughts and behaviors come from, and learning skills of intentionality to actually be the person that you would like to be.
That's fascinating. I've never thought about it like that, and I think it makes a lot of sense because you're taking young people who have agreed to step into a life of service, but they don't know at that point. I mean, obviously there are great high schools out there that are teaching people to be young people of character, but you don't. That is a very kind of college level experience to start to peel back what it means to be a leader and what it means to be a good person. So it's one of my questions for today was going to be if you're gonna start teaching, 18-year-olds how to
Mhm,
step up and be a leader and begin them on the path towards becoming a junior officer, becoming a young leader in outside of school, where do you begin? And I think
mhm.
that makes a lot of sense to, like, make sure that your own to use a Marine Corps expression, all your stuff is in one sock as an
Right, exactly.
individual before you start leading others. I have one question it goes a little bit back to the beginning of what you were saying. So when you transitioned from the fleet to studying at the University of Illinois, I'd be very interested. Like, obviously, you were concerned with leadership for a long time at that point. You had been an officer for a while, and you had taught before as well. I'd be very interested to hear as you began your psychology studies. Were there principles that you felt like were or aspects of your leadership style that you felt really strongly about, or you felt really secure in, that then through your studies you were kind of like, oh, I never thought of it that way, or oh man, I've been doing this wrong.
Yeah, I would say that, jumping into academia was pretty interesting. It really is just a completely different perspective. I remember Notre Dame played Alabama in the national championship game, and I tried to talk to one of my professors about that, and the point I was trying to make is I think that was for the players on the team, that was the 3rd or 4th time they played in the national championship game.
Wow.
Whereas for the Notre Dame team, it was the first time that any of the coaches had played in the national championship game. So I was just thinking about like what that did to culture and what that experience was like and what an advantage that was. And literally my professor started citing correlations that had been published in papers that were relevant to that. And
Wow.
it struck me how interesting it was that ins that it was almost completely abstract to them, and the fact that it was happening in the real world was interesting to them and perhaps unexpected.
Oh, yeah.
I would say the, probably the most impactful things for me in studying psychology and thinking about leadership was the personality and the cognitive side of things. I kind of had an intuition about this when I was leading, and I would say the intuition was to try to essentially program people at the level of what I would call the schema or the idea that's actually happening in the head. And what's interesting about that to me is that we like to talk at people a lot. And I mean, I think actually people who do this well, if you're on a sports team, you don't spend a lot of time talking to people. You make them do drills. You build muscle memory. Same thing with the Marine Corps, I'm sure. If you start taking fire, then everybody in the platoon's gonna know exactly what to do when to take fire. So you have these immediate actions, and they're not really cognitive. They're almost more habitual and responsive. So, I had worked on that kind of concept in the fleet in teaching people how to shoot Tomahawk missiles. It starts because when you get a message that tells you what your targets are. And so there's a flow path from I receive this message. When I receive this message, then I have to download here, and then I have to put this information in the computer, and I have to spin up the computer. So there's actually a signal path. And so what we used to do to try to teach that was to have people ride the signal path from a message comes on board all the way until a missile goes away. And what that does is that makes it so that when they're sitting at their console putting something in, they know what the structure of the information that is available to them coming in, and they know what the endpoint is. And so they can anticipate, you know, who their customer is down the line, and they can if there's something they're not receiving, they understand what the inputs are and can pull from it. And so moving people through that kind of signal path was building an understanding of the whole process in an experiential way. And I will say, I found more language for that quite a bit so in studying cognitive psychology. And then on the personal level, I'm endlessly fascinated by personality and what those dynamics are. I'm convinced, we look at other humans and there's a concept called theory of mind, which is my theory of mind is how am I projecting what I think you're thinking? And so the most basic theory of mind is I think you're just an object, I guess. Ratchet that up just a little bit. I can think whatever I'm thinking and project that onto you and assume you're thinking the same thing I'm thinking, right? Then we could go all the way to the point where I recognize that I don't have an understanding of what you're thinking and I'm curious about that, right? And so with personality, I think we're projecting ourselves onto other people all the time. And our thoughts and our feelings about things. And I've become pretty convinced that through personality, you can understand systematic ways in which people are experiencing the universe in a completely different way. And we talked a little bit about the whether you're a rule follower or whether you're a principle follower. So that's one of the probably 4 core dimensions that kind of differentiate people. But then back applying that to leadership and thinking about how you interact with people most effectively, how they're going to experience things and make decisions, what's important to them, and so forth. Those would probably be the most important or most interesting things for me as I move that process.
Yeah, that is absolutely fascinating, and one thing that came into my head just towards the end while you were talking is, like, as a junior officer at a squadron, we would have a Marine who would do something that was not within what was appropriate, and so the CO unfortunately had to waste a ton of time coming up with, like, a punishment for this Marine, and I used to think about, I had some really great leaders, and it's not necessarily important what the punishment is, what's important is what the outcome is. And
Mm,
so I would think about when I heard them say that, I was thinking about, okay, if I were in that young person's shoes who had done this thing, what would I need to hear? What would I need to have occur that would actually affect
mm,
my behavior that would resonate with me? And so that's really fascinating to hear. Yeah, like you said, in your studies, putting language to these concepts and the idea of, and please correct me if I'm saying this incorrectly, but the theory of mind, you talked about going from a complete inability to imagine that the person you're interacting with has a thought process. And then moving on that spectrum towards being able to accurately predict and understand how your actions or what you're saying might how that might impact that other person. I think that's a tremendously important, skill for a leader.
Yeah, absolutely. I find that endlessly interesting. The sad thing is even though you understand all the dynamics, it doesn't necessarily make you good at it. Makes you a little bit
Yeah.
better at it, maybe, but it makes you ask the right questions, but it doesn't necessarily make you know the right answers.
That's a great point, and this is, I know, a topic of key importance to leadership in academia, especially is, the fallacy that leaders are born and can't be taught. But there are things that you can teach, and there are concepts you can instruct, and there's language that you can put on a lot of these concepts. But you might have a great understanding of a lot of these concepts, but acting appropriately and implementing them appropriately. I would be interested in your thought process. Is that an innate thing? Obviously, I think some people probably get it a little bit more easily, but how do you bridge that gap between teaching these competencies and actually having them enacted?
I think so 2 things. I think perhaps the most important thing you can do for people is to make them curious and make them realize that there's a game afoot that they might not have even be considering. So I think that's a big part of it. And then giving them a framework or a model or a principle that they can start to use to analyze that space. That's kind of the way that I thought about it. And one of my favorite topics is, well, personality. Another is attachment, which looks at how your kind of early childhood experiences frame the way that whether or not the world is a safe place and what your expectations of other people are within that. And that one in particular, it's for people who think the world's a safe place and feel like relationships are safe, then it's not a very important topic. But for people who don't, suddenly they can start to understand the way that they're showing up in relationships and start to understand what their motivations are to be showing up in those ways and to see the way that they're showing up is actually causing the problems,
Mm.
so it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But so to make them curious about that and realize that, number 1, not everyone is experiencing relationships and safety and security the same way you are. And number 2, it probably comes from somewhere. And most people, once they start asking the question, can kind of go in and understand, well, of course, this is the way I think the world is because this is what happened to me. Like, okay. The question is, how is that serving you? Is that the way that you want to continue to be in the future? That becomes that opportunity for growth. So it's not algorithmic, right? It doesn't answer all of the questions for people, but hopefully it opens up the right questions and gives them the framework to think about it and to apply their own experiences to it.
Absolutely, and I think that is so fascinating to hear because one thing that I thought a lot about when I was in college as an English major, my aunt, like cousin on my father's side, she's a psychiatrist and she told me that, one of the greatest things you can study if you're interested in psychology undergrad
Mhm.
is literature. And everything you just described about like, that was a deeply psychological concept about understanding how people have different like, how people interface, not just interpersonally, but with the concept of relationships.
Right, right,
I think a lot like, that is such a deeply psychological thing, and it's important to understand that both from trying to help an individual who may be struggling with that problem, but then also just for a leader to understand that, you could be doing a great job for 99 out of 100 people, but there are certain people who have different ways that they interact. And so understanding that there could be something fundamentally different just about how they perceive relationships would be such a powerful tool. Maybe you can't immediately address that, but knowledge and understanding that that's a concept is really powerful, I think.
right. Yeah, it's almost impossible to be a leader and to not be tapping into kind of our archetypes of parents, right? And so the fact that your follower is responding to you in a way that you can't make any logical sense of. It's like, I care about you. I'm giving you the structure. I want you to succeed. I'm giving you positive feedback. Like, I don't understand why this person isn't responding to that. And it is because they're looking at you, but they're tapping into an archetype that isn't you. Once again, that you're not gonna just because you know that, you're not gonna know what the answer is. But
Yeah.
realizing that helps guide the way perhaps a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean, what a great thing to understand, not just about leadership, but just about having your own relationships and understanding as you meet people and make friendships and make, relationships, how important that is. So, another interesting thing, so we've talked a little bit about how you begin instructing young people on leadership. We've talked a little bit about competencies, how they can be taught. What I'm pretty fascinated in as well is in your work at the academy, you measure the performance of competencies longitudinally, so over a period of time. Can you talk about what are you guys measuring? And then how do you actually measure that over time?
Yeah, a great question. So, number one, I want to start with so my role now, I'm the director for the Center for Leadership Research and Assessment. It's a center that literally we just stood up in June, so it's new. It's gift funded. I'm the Dave and Amy Dawson 88 director of the center. Yeah, so I like curiosity and I like humility, and so I think those are pretty important. So I like to bring those to this whole endeavor. And in order to answer the questions that we care about, we have to believe that we know how to measure character and we know how to measure leadership. And I kind of start with the assumption that I'm not sure we do know how to measure those things. So that's part of what I'm trying to figure out. So I think that's going to be an iterative process over time. Our strategy towards that is we're running a series of longitudinal baseline surveys, and we're literally working with academia. Whoever is studying interesting things in this regard, literally, we're having conversations and say, bring your variables. And if you bring your variables here, we can put them into this pot. Any grit, resilience, hardiness, values, you name it. And we can measure that on our students, and then we can watch how it plays out and see what is actually predicting. And then we can also look at things like I was talking about attachment. So we measure attachment, we measure personality. So are those things predictive of these other character traits, for instance, that might predict performance in the future? And what's interesting, they might differentially predict performance in different domains, right? So that might actually inform kind of counseling for people on, you're interested in this, but you have some characteristics that might make you really good at these things. Whenever you're measuring these things, people get squeamish, I think, because you're always going to have some type of subjectivity in the measure. But I think we disregard to some degree the degree to which humans are meaning making machines. Being able to discern the character of another person is actually pretty important to our survival. And so I think our minds are actually pretty good at it. We can't always put the right kind of psychological or philosophical word to it, but I think we have an intuitive sense to a large degree. So our strategy on this is what we're doing this next semester is we developed an app called the Leader's Compass, and we're using this to actually replace the performance management within the Brigade of Midshipmen. And
Wow.
so we defined a set of 28 competencies and we broke them out by class. So I was just describing our classes. So the first set of competencies for the plebes are self leadership. So self awareness, self management, emotional intelligence, cultural awareness, those kinds of things. The second set of competencies are related to the ethics course. So prudence, courage, temperance, etc. The third set of competencies are interpersonal skills. And the fourth set of competencies are small unit leadership. And so the way that the performance management in the Brigade of Midshipmen is gonna go down is you're essentially being rated on those competencies by your chain of command
Wow.
twice a semester. And so you're being rated on these at the same time as you're taking these classes, your plebe year, your sophomore year, and so forth. And then the nice thing about the Leader's Compass is that it's very portable. And so not only does it support the Brigade of Midshipmen, it can also support summer training, different all kinds of different summer training. So going overseas on a language and regional expertise trip, I did that a couple times. So I took six midshipmen to Mongolia for a month. That's a lot of
Wow.
interaction time. That was crazy. Yeah.
That's crazy.
We took a minivan over a mountain pass. Yeah, I mean, when I say
Oh my
minivan,
gosh.
just pick any minivan you see driving down the road, and that's pretty much what we drove through a mountain pass. But you get to know people pretty well, right? And so built into the compass is this ability for at the end of it to take specific competencies that people want to develop during that experience and to get feedback at the end. You rate yourself. The way it works is you take a stack of say 6 people and they have to comparatively rank each other. And so you're comparatively ranking yourself, and then the faculty or staff member does the same thing and then also gives an objective score. So out of that experience, you're getting feedback, you're getting your self-assessment, peer assessment, faculty staff assessment, and then an objective score. And that's in addition to the feedback that you're getting within the brigade of midshipmen. So what we're really trying to do with this with these competencies is we call our strategy like the tapestry. So lots of times when people are doing assessment, you'll measure something, you'll do an intervention, try to train people or something, and then you'll measure it again. And you say, well, did it change from time A to time B? So instead of doing that, what we're doing is we've got this tapestry of information and input and feedback on people's competencies over the time at the Naval Academy. So that's in the background. So you can pick any experience, and there's going to be people who didn't do that experience. So I can compare how people who did the experience changed on every dimension that I care about,
Wow.
and how people who didn't, compare on every dimension that I care about. So that's our basic strategy. So number one, you want to have frequent measures from people who are interacting closely with the people that you're interested in. And then we're also using these other studies to refine our measurements across the board.
That's incredible, and I mean, it's so exciting that you're just starting that now because you can this is one of those things, I mean, like any study, the more data you have, the more you can refine,
Right.
the model or the approach, so that's super exciting that it's just starting, and it'll be interesting to keep tabs on it, not just from, what are the outcomes, but then kind of systematically or maybe programmatically, what are we changing? So maybe in 3 or
Right.
4 years, you're
Right.
like, "We're not getting what we want out of this aspect of it. Let's work on changing it." So that's super cool just to get the ball rolling 'cause that thing is gonna snowball into it sounds like it's gonna be make a big impact. So that's super exciting.
That's where we want to go. Yep.
So doing some of my research about your work, I read a little bit about the no, do, be model,
Hmm.
and I was just wondering, could you give us a short description of what that model is and how leaders can use it to better understand their interactions?
Yeah, absolutely. We stole it from the Army. They do no, be, do. So we fixed it.
Okay.
You're welcome, Army. But really, with the know and the do, if you think about a competency and moving through the competency, just knowing that it exists in the first place and starting to get some frameworks and some knowledge around it and then having the opportunity to go practice it and actually connecting those together. Because lots of times you'll learn something in the classroom and then you go have an experience. So there's not necessarily something connecting it together. So we started a Center for Experiential Leader Development. I had the opportunity to lead that when I first got here, and it's continued to grow since then. So that's the whole point of the experiential leader development is to connect what you were learning with what you experience, but then you also have to feed that back, right?
Yeah.
So you have to have a feedback loop. Okay, this thing just happened to you. What meaning do you make of it? What do you learn from it? What do you know about yourself? What do you know about situations? What do you know about other people that you didn't know before? So you have this feedback loop of know and do, and with the endpoint of a kind of Aristotelian habit formation, right? Which is perhaps another definition for character. What is your natural way of being? And so hopefully this no do feedback loop is feeding this be, so that ultimately you can have the character and the knowledge and the ability to be in a situation and to do the things that you need to do. So that's kind of the framework as we conceptualize it.
Just hearing you talk through it, I feel like that totally just encapsulated everything we've been talking about this whole time, and we mentioned knowing and understanding the things that you need to do is different from doing them and doing them effectively, and then ultimately the desired end state is to be a person of character and to be a leader of character, and that's where the B comes in to my understanding of the model. So
That's
I think it's
exactly
really
right.
helpful just in terms of understanding, a lot of people, whether it's in business, whether it's in the military, wherever, they want to help the people who work in their organizations improve and become better at their jobs and better team players. And I think the no do be model is a helpful small tool that obviously is the broad strokes of what would then become to actually execute that model is a lot more complex, but that's
If
a
I can
helpful
add
tool.
something on there too, I would say that, in the corporate world, I think a lot of times people stop at the do as well, and they don't get all the way to the be. You need you need to be able to execute this. And I think like the whole, KPI kinda model, key performance indicators, we wanna frame everything in key performance indicators, which is all about do. But ultimately, what you really want is to be. And I think the program that you're in and other programs like that actually do a pretty nice job of not just the knowledge piece, bringing you all the way to the B piece.
Yeah, I agree, and I shout out my, Management 6100 course. My professor, Michael Park, was awesome, and it was Curtin's approach to bringing everybody together for a week or 2 to set the baseline in terms of how the school wants you to view leadership going forward, and I really enjoyed the course. I thought he was an amazing professor, and all the concepts they taught were really cool. So we talked a lot about your work at the Naval Academy, but you wear many hats. You are also an executive coach for the Harvard Business School. I would be very interested in what that experience has been like. What are some of the major themes that you end up getting asked about, or major themes that you end up coaching folks on up at HBS?
Yeah, so I'll do my own shout out. The program that I work the most with is the Program for Leadership Development. Professor Josh Mogolis. I think it's a fantastic program. What I really like about it is it actually the students think that they're going to learn something and they don't expect to be changed. But the whole program, both what they're learning in the class, they come together as a learning group and we use that as a sandbox to practice different interactions and relationships and ways of being. And then the coaching aspect that goes along with it, I think is just a really nice dynamic to move people not just through the no, but all the way to the B. A couple of my reflections and insights, I would say from coaching in the in exec ed at HBS is one thing as a military person, you get a shocking amount of responsibility early. I mean, I kind of talked about that. You're the sonar officer, but not only the sonar officer, but you're the sonar officer leading 15, 20 people, including the senior chief who's probably been in the Navy 15 years, and knows a lot more than you do. So that's kind of natural for us to be thrown into those roles. What I find a lot of exec ed, they've gotten to where they're at because they're great operators, and now they need to make that transition to manager or leader. And so that's I would say one of the hardest things is letting go of the things that got you here and being willing to not be good at things. It's almost like being a good high school athlete and coming to college, and suddenly you're the best on the team, and then you're worse on the team. But transitioning to management and as you go each level higher is the same. I would say some of the key things that I find myself teaching over and over again or conversing about, I'm not really teaching, I'm coaching, but you never stop being a person. I don't care what role you're in. And so kind of going back to this plebe leadership concepts, just the basics of being a human never stop applying. And the other thing is the people that you're working with never stop being humans as well. And so I'm keeping that in mind. I mean, because just the dynamics of a business, of a bureaucracy, hierarchy, and so forth can kind of depersonalize these things and put us in these situations where we think there's some type of algorithmic way to solve the problems that we're in, as opposed to um, being a person interacting with people and figuring out how to solve that. Along those lines, I would say that peace does not equal not having conflict. Peace equals the ability to resolve conflict effectively. And I don't care whether you're talking about a marriage or a friendship or a business situation. People shy away from conflict. People do, and this is another thing, people do a lot of emotional labor. And I'm almost always trying to convince people not to do emotional labor. And I think you can not avoid emotional labor. You can, when you're having emotions, identify that there's a problem going on and find a way to speak those emotions to other people in a way that leads to resolution of the problem. So really active forms of conflict negotiation, conflict resolution, I think that those are really important skills that most people just don't have naturally. And even we're all in relationships, but we're not necessarily doing it well in
Yeah.
every aspect of our life. So it's not like I could just I'm gonna just take my marriage behavior to work and everything's gonna work out great.
I think just thinking about a lot of the work you've done and a lot of the work that you're, coaching and pushing young leaders towards has to do with ethical leadership and doing the ethical thing. So I've got kind of a simple question that I think may require a not simple answer, but I think whether it's in the military, so if you're leading on a submarine, there will be times when you can make a leadership decision that could be easier for you, but may not be the right thing to do. I think the same thing is true, obviously, in anything that we do, whether it's in industry or business. There are opportunities, and we've seen a lot of corporations do the wrong thing because they're expedient, but at the expense of ethics. And so I think everyone who's concerned with ethics and trying to do the right thing would agree that it's always right to do the right thing. But I guess, why is that the case? Why should people be compelled to make ethical decisions? And then what are the outcomes on an organization or on the culture of an organization when you make the wrong decision ethically?
It's funny, if you take an evolutionary perspective, we evolved in very small groups, and nothing stinks more than hypocrisy. Nothing erodes trust more than hypocrisy. And on the flip side of that, I don't think there's anything more valuable in the universe than other people's energy and commitment. And I think we're short-sighted and we don't think of those as value propositions. But I think they truly are. Like I said, we define everything as KPIs and whatnot, as opposed to trying to build an organization that's honestly committed to excellence. And when you talk about ethics, I mean, I think people can get really confused about ethics, but I I believe in the ethics of goodness, beauty, and truth, and I believe in probably the most fruitful thing that you can do is to try to attune yourself to goodness, beauty, and truth, and try to align your life to goodness, beauty, and truth. And I don't think you have to work too hard to fill those words in, because I think people know what's more and less beautiful, what's more and less true, what's more and less good. So I think that's the way that we order our lives as individuals. I think that's the way that we order our relationships. Yeah, honestly caring for the well-being of others. Yeah, I think it's hard to capture how
Yeah.
much value that actually brings to I mean, this is a long thing, but I won't get too far into it, but it's amazing to think about how many corporate and legal structures are literally not just misaligned, but are maybe completely antithetical to that perspective. You could argue that companies have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize their profit, and once you get into a profit framework, there's always money coming in and money going out. One of the places money is always going out is to labor. And so you could make an argument, oftentimes a company has a fiduciary responsibility to minimize, the pay to the people working there to the minimum possible to maximize the profit. That's antithetical to actually caring about people's well-being.
Well, and I think that's such a good point. Like, if we lead organizations and we only care about that one goal, you may achieve and you may maximize that goal to some degree. But the way I see it is, you're kind of building not a house of cards, but you're
Yeah,
building on a spoiled foundation. And I think when you, like you talked about, if you care about the people that work with you, and if you're invested in them as humans and as people, maybe there's an instance wherein you may not make as much on the bottom line, or your profit might be not as great as it might otherwise be. But I do believe that an organization that is grounded in ethics and cares about its people and tries to do the right thing and tries to do the good thing will, over the long term, endure, because I think you're building a much more durable organization. You're building a culture where people want to come to work. And I think there are just so many examples of, you know, if you're enjoying what you're doing, you're going to do better. It's kind of a funny thing when I think when you make those slick little decisions, or you think nobody's going to notice, or whatever, you erode the trust of the people you work with. You create that level of hypocrisy, which I completely agree is among the most corrosive things you can do. And then, in a more dramatic sense, if you do make large unethical decisions, you're completely killing the
yeah,
foundation and the
yeah.
bones of your organization, and ultimately, you're setting yourself up for failure long term, absolutely.
If I can throw one more thing on there, I would say that we have a pretty low opinion of humanity, and we treat, humans as economic units. And I think this is what I think is true about humans. We weren't made for comfort, we were made for greatness. And the power of tapping into that, and the real point that I'm trying to say is, when people think about taking care of people and think about culture and all, I think the place a lot of people's minds go to is, like, having ping pong tables in the office and whatnot. We didn't have any ping pong tables on a submarine, right? But we were deeply committed to excellence. And I think people massively underestimate how much people are deeply committed to excellence and how motivating that is. And if you can create an environment where people are simultaneously deeply committed to excellence and have that kind of leeway that we were talking about to be creative and to find new solutions into things. I mean, in some ways, it's funny, like, that is almost like the story of America. You know, we gave people kind of the freedom, and the economic structure at the time motivated people to, pursue excellence, because pursuing excellence could actually be monetized in a way.
Yeah.
And we didn't have social structures and whatnot, so there's an enormous amount of freedom to move within this open structure. We've consolidated and coagulated into this corporate structure now, in which we no longer believe in those kind of core principles, and how much the pursuit of excellence and the desire to be great is a true motivation for, I think, almost every human. You have to What the military does, and I'm sure you saw this in the Marine Corps, you have people coming from all types of backgrounds, and you have people who coming from backgrounds in which excellence was never part of what life was about, and they're put into a situation where that is being demanded of them, and they can see other people pursuing it, and it's transformative. It's one of the reasons why I think the military transforms so many young people, because it does put them into cultures of competence and excellence, and lets them see another way of being, and it's just hard to let go of that once you've experienced it.
Absolutely. I mean, as you're talking, I'm just thinking about, like you said, so many great sailors, so many great Marines. What's interesting has been, as young officers in leadership positions, conflating the idea of, looking after your Marines, looking out for your Marines, and taking it too easy, and allowing the sliding scale of standard as opposed to a hard line standard. And what's always interesting is, maybe in the first few interactions, the guys would, not be happy or not enjoy as you're trying to stand the standard back up. But the guys and girls didn't join the Marines for comfort. They joined for greatness. They want to be challenged. People want to grow. And I think that's, I've always thought of that as a cultural thing that you can help build, that you want to surround
Right,
yourself with people
right.
who want to excel. But I think perhaps you're right. Maybe it's less a unique trait of certain people and more a trait of all humans, that we do want to achieve, if not our maximum potential, a greater potential. And it's on us as leaders to help tap into that. I think that's such an awesome point.
And I think we like to set ethics aside to this other realm, but I think ethics at the end of the day is the pursuit of the excellent, and what's the realm of the excellent? Goodness, beauty, and truth.
Yeah, that's a very elucidating stance on that, and I appreciate that perspective immensely. So we're getting up on time here, so I've got my classic closing question for you. If you had one trait or principle that all young leaders should work on or aspire to, what would it be and why?
Ownership. What I love in the Navy, what we teach is that every time you give an order, it's your order. I don't care if your commander just said it into your face and you turn around and say it to somebody else. When you're saying an order, it's your order. And when it's your order, it's also your responsibility to make it work. The most enjoyable thing about leadership is that sense of ownership. It is incredibly burdensome. Once again, we weren't made for comfort, we were made for greatness. And leaning into that ownership, and you're gonna fail and you're gonna make mistakes, but the right way to fail and make mistakes is using your best imagination and creativity to come up with a solution for the way you want the organization to be. And you'll be wrong, and they'll sometimes you'll have leaders that won't accept that, and they'll stifle you and they'll limit you. And that's the world that we live in. But that's the way to fail. I mean, if you have a leader who's gonna stifle you and limit you, then it doesn't mean you can't have an imagination and you can't fill up every crevice of the things that you lead with your own, vision, your desire for greatness, your desire for excellence. It's the only way to play the game, and people don't like to do it because it's not comfortable and it is costly. It's gonna take, the higher you go, it'll eventually take more than you have, and you realize that I mean, to be the captain of a ship, I don't think there's a single human alive in the history of the world who actually has the capacity to completely fulfill the responsibility just of being the captain of a ship. But I was coaching soccer and it was the final game. It was the championship game. And we went to goal kicks, and I had to grab a little girl and I said, I need you to be the goalie. And she's not even a regular goalie. She's a great athlete. And she said, I don't know if you can do it. And I said, I don't know if you can either, but if you can't do it, nobody can. Right. You're our best shot. And what you realize is, don't shy away from leadership because it's bigger than you are and whatnot. Use everything in your person to fill it up.
Yeah, I think that's so great, and taking ownership, of course, I think is such a massively important thing, but I also love that idea of, the classic, "If not me, then who?" And
Right.
raising your hand to go into a situation because maybe nobody's ready. But at least man, we're getting right into Clicheville. You're like, at least your place will never be among those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. So I apologize for taking your great answer and
No,
injecting it
no,
with
no.
two quotations, but they immediately came to mind. So lastly, you've got a lot on your plate. You got a lot going on, swinging between Cambridge and Annapolis. You guys are always working on something with foreign militaries as well. Is there anything that's coming up in the next few months that you're particularly excited about?
I love it all. Stay tuned. We're gonna launch a journal that is going to revolutionize the social sciences.
And where can people find that if they wanna learn more about it?
Still a gleam in the eye right now. Probably linked to the Naval Academy website. It'll probably be called something like the Naval Academy Journal of Leadership. We're going to take a truly scientific approach to the social sciences and see what we can do.
I think it's gonna be pretty exciting to check it out, and definitely keep us posted because we'll be sure to help share the word about the journal. That's an exciting endeavor for sure. Yeah, well, Kevin, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you for the opportunity. Great to talk to you.
Thanks so much for listening to Lead with Bubba Scott. This episode was recorded and edited with Riverside.fm. Theme music developed with Suno AI. If you enjoyed the show, please follow and leave a review wherever you find your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on Instagram at Lead with Bubba and let us know your thoughts in the comments. See you next time.